Guys, here's an example of why Israelis support judicial review and the reasoning behind why they're pushing judicial review legislation forward.
Who stopped them was the court. And the court, zero accountability. You cannot even investigate its role. So that's one example. A second example is fighting terror. In this Knesset, we passed a law, coalition and opposition together, to take away citizenship from people, citizens of Israel, that are getting paid by the Palestinian Authority to kill Jews. They murdered, and then they get compensation and money from the Palestinian Authority. And they get extra. According to the Palestinian Authority law, they get extra money because they have an Israeli citizenship, because it's easier to make the terror act with the Israeli citizenship. Now we passed this law in this Knesset. Waste of time, because the court will ignore it or cancel it, as it did to many, many similar laws in the past.
Right.
So you have a coalition and opposition that have a certain way to fight terror, and the court just negates this way. And the third example is the ultra-Orthodox draft law, which is a big problem in Israel. It's going around in the system in Israel for 30 years, even more. And any solutions that the body politics of Israel, the Knesset, tries to bring to this issue, and there were many solutions, good, bad, some I like, some I dislike, is canceled by the court. And we're destined to go over and over to this social, political, economical fight. Over and over again, and we can never get to any agreement.
Because you have
the left in Israel has become increasingly radicalized and anti-Zionist, or at least post-Zionist, and the fulcrum of that radicalization has been the Supreme Court of Israel. Through the judicial revolution that the former president of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, enacted between 1992 and 1995, when the Supreme Court seized for itself, arrogated the power to overturn Knesset laws, and then in subsequent years seized more and more governing powers from the government and legislative powers from the Knesset, and accepted no limits on its powers that it had arrogated it to itself without legal basis. That process of arrogating the powers of Israel's elected officials also engendered a radicalization of the courts. By ending standing requirements in the courts, Barak invited what became a cottage industry of non-governmental organizations that were formed, political organizations operating under the aegis of human rights, to undermine government policies, to undermine Jewish sovereignty, Israel's identity as a Jewish state, and a whole host of domestic and strategic issues. And those NGOs are funded in large measure by foreign governments, largely from Europe, but also from the United States, that are engaged in a political war against Jewish statehood, Jewish nationalhood, Jewish nationalism, and Zionism. And so a report that just came out from Im Tirtzu, which is a nationalist, a Zionist student organization in Israel, they just published a report that was covered by Channel 14 News. And what they found was the depth of foreign funding of the self-proclaimed civil rights or human rights organizations that have petitioned the court hundreds of times every year. And so what they found was that the funding of these organizations from 2017 to 2022, just for, I think it was 32 organizations, it reached 300 million shekels.
To design Israel's constitutional structure, right? Whether it be the power to strike down laws, which is a court invention, whether it be the binding counsel of the Attorney General, a court invention, the use of reasonableness in its current form, a court invention. So, and the truth is that every aspect of this reform is simply bringing Israel more into line with democratic norms around the world. The current situation is what is unique.
I want to ask you, there is a consensus that Israel's judicial system is flawed, and specifically the way that Supreme Court justices are elected. But is this reform, the way it is presented now, really the solution? Because will minority groups that feel unrepresented by the court see themselves reflected in those judges?
So, currently, as you said, the selection process is completely unique around the world. Today, the judges have a veto over the appointment of new judges, which essentially prevents bold thinkers, original thinkers, from people who have different jurisprudential philosophies from being appointed as judges. And the truth is that that appointment by elected officials is the norm around the world.
That right and left have broadly agreed on for probably 30 years. Not exactly what reforms are needed, but the mainstream in Israel across the board understands there need to be reforms. And there's a simple reason. Starting in the late 80s, Justice Aaron Barak, then the president of the Supreme Court, and by the way, a professor of mine in law school, started aggregating power to the court, power unheard of in any free country in the world, something that Americans couldn't actually imagine. For example, there's a combination, there's no constitution, there's no written constitution, no balance of powers. So there's a combination of powers the court has taken for itself and no one can stop them. For example, there's no concept of standing or justiciability. And they have a concept of reasonableness. Now, what do those mean when you put them together? In America, in order to have a case come before a court, in order for them to have the power, the right to decide something, the case has to be justiciable. It means it has to be, someone has to be suffer for it, has to have standing to bring it to the court, and the court has to have the right to make the decision. Not everything is justiciable. They've wiped that out here. Literally anything is justiciable. At whose decision, at whose discretion? The courts itself. And they apply a doctrine called reasonableness. Now, reasonableness exists in other countries, but not like it does here. Here, what it means is a judge decides something's unreasonable and simply nullifies it. I'll give you an example because it's really hard for Americans to even conceive of what kind of power this is. The court here can nullify an election. The public votes on an individual, and the court says, well, I think it was unreasonable, in my opinion, there's no standard. The judge says, in my opinion, I think it was unreasonable for this person to be a candidate. And so call this whole election off. It doesn't matter what the people think. That's the least democratic thing imaginable, right? They have intervened in the Knesset's ability to even discuss
What will happen in the next election? The Likud voters are just going to go crazy after this thing. And in the next election, you will have a 70-seat majority for the right. So this would be suicidal on the parts of these elites. As long as we're a democracy, a minority can't force itself on the majority forever. Right. What is going to happen? So the left is now, you're right in sensing that they're willing to burn the house down. And we see this in their economic behavior, which is basically BDS behavior. BDS is the boycott and divestment movement that the Palestinians are using to try and isolate Israel economically. Now the Israeli left is acting in this way. And this is, to my mind, all over the Western world. There is a globalist elite that resents democracy and so is always in favor of international institutions, of judiciaries rather than parliaments, and these people are going to defend their anti-democratic rule probably to the last. It's also true of America. The